Wednesday, a new event is starting for the next month and a half. Nick Huggett, who is a senior visiting fellow at the center, is organizing a senior visiting fellow seminar in the philosophy of physics. The title is Cosmology Beyond Space-Time. It's going to be happening every Wednesday for the next 6 weeks, starting this coming Wednesday at 10:15 a.m. For both the next lunchtime talk by Melissa Jacquard and the Cosmology Beyond Space-Time, organized by Nick Huggett on Wednesdays, you can find the links to register on the center's website. So go to the calendar and find the links there to join us for these events. John Norton's talk, that had to be cancelled on Tuesday, will happen on the 12th of February, on February 12th, at 11:30 a.m. So half an hour earlier than usual. And we hope to see all of you for this event as well. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers who are co-authoring a paper on the rubber hand illusion. So we'll hear all about that. So I won't tell you what that is before they tell us what they think it is. So Wen is a friend of the center, and most of you know him. He's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He's also the associate director of the Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition. He's published widely in the philosophy of cognitive science and neuroscience in the best journals, as one say, Journal of Philosophy, Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, on consciousness, attention, agency, and so on and so forth. He has written one, maybe the most influential book, I think the most influential book on attention, called Attention. And I believe that Wen is working on the second version of the book, and we're looking forward to this updated version. And he's also working, was working until recently on a new book on agency, I believe, right? That's right. Exactly. So Peter Lush, who is Wen's co-author for this project, is a research fellow in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Sussex, and has published also widely on a range of topics. So I had a look at his range of publication and downloaded a few papers. So I'm looking forward to know more about his work, including the rubber hand illusions. Also the role of domain characteristics in psychology, hypnosis, I'm not sure how to say it in English, which is a fantastic topic. Personally, I was skeptical of hypnosis for a very long time, until I was on the dissertation committee that reviewed a huge range of data on the matter. But one day I'd be curious to hear your thought about it. In any case, today they're going to be talking about the rubber hand illusion, and the space is yours.
Thanks. So we're going to split time. I'll go first, and let me just launch the talk. Okay, let me know if you can't see the screen.
Works well.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to look at the empirical argument for that attributes a special feature of ownership in the rubber hand illusion. And this, of course, is joint work with Pete. Actually, a lot of you are probably familiar with the rubber hand illusion. I'll show you a video in a moment that discusses it. But basically, you have this synchronous case where you're having your finger stroked by a brush, where you can't see your hand, and you can see a rubber hand that is being synchronously stroked. And this induces a kind of illusion, which we'll talk about more in a second. This was originally published by Botvinnik and Cohen, actually, while they were both here at Pittsburgh in 1998, in this one-page report in the journal Nature. Rubber hands feel, touch that I see, and I'll note that feels there is in quotes. And it really comes down to these, so you induce the illusion, and then you give people a questionnaire which has a bunch of statements. And I've reproduced the three main statements that have to do with people's experiences. And I'll call the first one S1. And so what you're doing here is just you're noting the level of agreement that you have. So lots of people agree with this statement. It seemed as if I were feeling the touch of the paintbrush in the location where I saw the rubber hand touched. And that sounds like what they're reacting to is a kind of spatial illusion in the experience of touch on the body. The second one is it seemed as though the touch that I felt was caused by the paintbrush touching the rubber hand, and that seems to be a kind of experience of causality. And then I felt as if the rubber hand were my hand, and that's the one that I think has really driven what became a new field of research, namely special phenomenal quality of ownership of the body. And this has been a highly influential paper since 1998. It's been cited over 3,700 times. And even this year alone, I think it's been around 60 or so times. And I'm sure even today, there have been a few additional citations. So highly influential, yeah, it's pretty good for a one-page paper. It's normally thought to be a perceptual illusion, namely a kind of somatosensory distortion or a change in your experience of your body, or a multisensory illusion. I won't read these quotes, but if you have some concerns about how to precisely understand the effect, we can come back to that. What I want to do now is just show you a very short clip. This is from a BBC Two video, and what you're going to see is two people, Larry and Edie. Larry's going to do, this is on the boardwalk in Santa Barbara, so it's not obviously a controlled experimental context, but Larry's going to induce the rubber hand illusion to Edie, who's a passerby. And what I want you to focus on near the end of the clip is going to be an exchange where they're talking about the experience that she's having. And I'm flagging S2, the causal claim, and S3, the ownership claim. Okay, so just have a listen to that dialogue.
Hi, I'm Larry. Hi. Very nice to meet you, Edie. We're going to do a little demonstration here called the rubber hand illusion. It's going to be a little scary.
This illusion may look like fairground fun, but it reveals one of the most important new ideas in brain science.
Thank you. Right. Good. And can you put this hand down right over here and just curl it up like the rubber hand's curled up a little bit? All right. Now, what I'm going to do is try to position the rubber hand so it looks like it's your own. Okay, could you imagine that being your own hand, kind of? Yeah. What we're going to do is we're going to stroke your fingers simultaneously, the rubber finger and your real finger, and hopefully this will convince you that the rubber hand is your own, that your brain will actually adopt this hand.
In the illusion, simply watching the rubber hand being stroked at the same time as the real hand is enough to trick the brain into adopting it as its own.
We like weird. And slowly but surely, you should feel that the hand you're looking at is actually part of your body.
Feels like you're touching my hand with that one.
Right, so it feels like this is your hand that I'm touching, right?
Yes.
You okay?
Yeah.
Good. Try that at home with your kids. Yeah. The rubber hand.
Okay. So that's sort of roughly how you might induce the illusion. What I'm interested in is the exchange. Again, this is not done in the lab, right? So it's, but anyway, here's Larry, and he says the following. He says, you know, as he's doing the induction, he says, hopefully this will convince you that the rubber hand is your own, and slowly but surely you should feel that the rubber hand you were looking at is actually part of your body. Note the kind of almost cognitive invitation there. Edie says, it feels like you're touching my hand with that one. So this is her own introspective report. And I'll just emphasize that she is giving you S2, the causal claim. Larry comes back and says, because he wants the ownership claim, obviously, for the cameras. He says, right, so it feels like this is your hand that I'm touching, right? To which she immediately responds, yes. Okay. So I'm interested in a variety of things here that we're going to touch on. I think this is a really, even though this is not done in the laboratory, it illustrates a lot of the points that Pete and I want to bring out. Okay, so that sort of data that is marked on these questionnaires provides the basis for the empirical argument for this sense of ownership, which has driven this field of embodiment and experience of the body. So you go from the questionnaire, we then, of course, require certain constraints. One, that you have to do the correct controls in the experiment. Two, since introspection is being used as kind of discrimination capacity, you want to appropriately have subjects appropriately direct introspection. And 3, of course, the use of introspection in that context ought to be reliable and give you an accurate report. Now, if you meet all 3 of those conditions, given the data, then I think it's a reasonable empirical argument to conclude that there is, in fact, a special feeling that you have of your body as your own, and that this can somehow be distorted and transferred to the ownership claim. Okay, we're going to focus on these 3 central premises because they're tied to 3 basic methodological assumptions. Again, that the data is only useful if you've done the right controls. The data that you collect is useful only if you've properly directed the instrument, in this case, introspection. And of course, the data is only useful if in the context in which you've deployed introspection, it tends to give you reliable results. Okay. The point here is that if any of those conditions fails, then the argument is relying on these false premises. And so we would argue that there is, in fact, no empirical grounds for drawing a conclusion. Now, one thing that's quite interesting is that, and Pete's been the one who experienced most of this because he's gotten a lot of pushback from the empirical community who is focused on the rubber hand illusion. A lot of them will just emphasize that in their own case, they've experienced the illusion. And this is certainly very powerful. Those of you who've experienced the illusion, you certainly, for many of you, you've had this kind of change in your experience. What I want you to note, though, is that I think this really keeps a lot of the kind of ideology for this experiment in place, but it's a different kind of argument. It's a familiar one. It's one where you move from the fact that you have first-person experience of a certain kind of phenomenology to the conclusion that, of course, there is such a phenomenology. And I think this happens in philosophy all the time, but it also happens in the sciences. And what you're doing here is, of course, you're skipping all the experimental conditions that are to ensure that, in fact, that conclusion is appropriate. And in this context, it's, in a sense, question begging, because one of the issues is, why we have these 3 conditions is to ensure that introspection as an instrument is being used to generate reliable data. So that kind of move from first-person report to the conclusion reflects the kind of lingering, I think, Cartesian attitude towards introspection in the sciences, in the science of consciousness. So this idea is just that introspection is a kind of direct readout of somatosensory experience. And the analogy would be to perceiving a target under sort of the most ideal conditions for perceiving that target. Say seeing something in the clear light of day. But we do know that, of course, perception can be noisy. So consider perceiving in a fog. And the point here is that introspection is no different. Of course, it's also subject to signal and noise issues. Okay. So if we ask about the question about the reliability of introspection, we're doing no different than we would when we think about perception itself. So we're going to try and argue that, in fact, the necessary conditions for the adequacy of the argument are violated. Therefore, the argument does not establish the conclusion, or give one good reason to think that there is a sense of ownership. I'm going to argue that the questionnaire does not, in fact, appropriately direct introspection as it needs to. That, in fact, there are many reasons to think that introspection is inaccurate in this case, and that proper controls would improve accuracy, but they've not been done. And this is going to be a large part of Pete's presentation. He and I agree that there is something that goes on when the induction works, and we do think that the rubber hand illusion is a useful tool. It just doesn't show that you have a sense of ownership, or at least a special feeling of ownership. So we'll draw some general lessons about what to do with respect to this sort of introspective data. Okay, let me begin with the condition about appropriate introspection by just pointing out that the questionnaire is, in a sense, functions as a kind of task instruction. That is, it's got to prompt the subjects to basically recall the experience, discriminate and detect some distinctive feature. And then the questionnaire has got to be adequate to directing introspection in the right way. So consider the first one, first statement. It seemed as if I were feeling the touch of the paintbrush in the location where I saw the rubber hand touched. So this always seemed obvious to me as a probe for a kind of spatial illusion, but it was in fact students in HPS. Zena Ward is the person I remember first raising this in a class that I had run where we were talking about the rubber hand illusion. And she pointed out that the way that she read it, and many of the other students did as well, was that what this prompt was really asking for was a kind of test. Namely, is the finger that's being touched on the rubber hand the same finger kind as the one that I'm feeling, right? And so in that case, what's going on is that the prompt is really not asking you to introspect. It's asking you to do a perceptual matching task. right? Is the visual location of that touch the same as the felt location of mine, i.e., for example, on the index finger? Okay, so I was surprised because it never struck me that S1 was ambiguous, but in fact, it is in that sense because it does misdirect some subjects to not introspect. And Pete has some reason to think that some of his own subjects might have had that response as well. So the thing to do here, remember, is that we're trying to make sure that introspection is appropriately directed. That just means that the questionnaire needs to be more refined. And so one quick idea would be that S1 should be replaced by something like this. I felt the touch on the rubber hand. And it would be interesting to see how many people actually agree with that formulation of the statement. I think that's much more clearly about introspection. Okay, since we're talking about introspection, let me just identify three models of it. I've already noted this kind of Cartesian direct readout model. So there's some kind of, if you like, phenomenal property of sensory experience that you can read out directly by introspection. A model that I prefer in this particular context is what I'll call reflection. So on this view, or one version of this view, the only kind of phenomenology that's in somatosensory experience of the body is sort of the normal stuff, feeling a tickle, a touch, and spatial content. And that's what you have here. Now, on top of that, if you have expectations of, so that something odd would be going on, then you might draw on those two sources, your normal sensory experience and your expectations, to basically reinterpret the experience. Okay, so that's a more complex kind of introspection that draws on other sources. And then Pete's notion, I think this is correct, is this idea of phenomenological control, which is that introspection is a kind of top-down influence that either alters the experience or alters your judgments about the experience, might create some form of experience to match your expectations. All right, so that's another kind of way in which your judgments here about what you're experiencing might be influenced that goes beyond the simplicity of a direct readout. So here are the three models that I think should be on the table. There are, of course, other ones. So what of introspection? So let's sort of fall back on that a little bit. Now, the one idea is that it's just a detection and discrimination capacity. You have to detect the presence of some kind of conscious feature, and then you have to discriminate the kind of feature it is. Part of the problem is that unlike perception, we don't have very good models of how introspection as a psychological discrimination detection capacity works. No good mechanisms, no good concept, it's process. So here's me offering one, which is inspired by remarks of the philosopher Gareth Evans. I'll call it simple introspection. So consider the following. Normally, when you feel a touch on your hand, I can ask you to report the presence of that stimulus. Right? So this is a report about the world. It's an observational report. And you might say something like, oh yes, there's a touch on my hand, or there's a touch on my thumb. In these same conditions, I can ask you to do something slightly different, which is that not report on the world, but to report on the presence of an experience. And here you would say, I feel a touch on my hand. Obviously, those can often be interchanged, right? So, but notice that the talk of feeling here is precisely to turn attention inward to one's experience. So the idea of simple introspection is just this. That second report is built on the channel that gives you the first observational report. I think that was a version of Evans's idea. If you buy that, that is to say, introspection, simple introspection piggybacks on sensory experience, then to the extent that sensory experience is reliable, so will introspection be, okay? So this is a version of the kind of readout view, and you can argue for its reliability because it's built on psychophysical reliability, right? So if the normal channel is reliable in point one, then in general, the introspective channel that's built on it will be reliable. And this is why I think Liz Irvine, for example, has sort of raised questions about introspection and asked why we don't just do the psychophysics. Right? That's a way of probing experience. Okay. I think this is a plausible way of explaining S1 reports, because remember, I think those express a kind of spatial illusion. Some of you might note that, of course, the model that I gave here about the reliability of simple introspection presupposes accurate perception. And of course, the rubber hand illusion is under a case of illusion. That's a problem for my competitors or my opponents, but we can come back to that. I think I can make the case for them that this is, in fact, a reliable way of generating a response to S1, probably. Okay, here's another point, though. Introspection is often not reliable. Consider thinking about the emotions, right? I think in terms of detection, we can often be quite reliable, noticing a change in our emotional state. I think there are cases in which discrimination can be quite unreliable. For example, am I feeling annoyance? Is it more like anger, kind of simmering anger? Our emotion concepts are not as fine-tuned as I think normal observational concepts. And in fact, this is the fodder for great literature, right? The fact that people aren't very good at introspecting their emotions. And that's, I think, in part due to the inability to sort of expertly categorize these emotions. All right, so Eric Schurzgabel has made a lot of these kind of cases, and I think he's right to think about the kind of unreliability for these mental phenomena. So here's an example. Think of feeling betrayed. Right? Some of you might have had this experience. I don't think there's a special emotional qualitative feel of betrayal. But if you don't like this example, I think you can come up with other ones. I think the point about feeling betrayed is that it's actually quite complex. It's got to involve a variety of cognitive states and memory, for example, that someone promised to do something and your belief that they didn't do it. You have to recognize that. You also have these emotional responses that are, and when you pull all those things together, you can talk accurately about feeling betrayed. But the point about that is that that complex is not something that is involved in a kind of simple readout, as in the case of space and touch, okay? So I like to call this reflection. And the idea here is that your report of feeling something can be accurate, but it's drawing on lots of different sources of information for you to reach that judgment. It's not a direct readout of some kind of qualitative X, okay? So here again, you can correctly report feeling betrayed, but it doesn't follow there's any kind of interesting qualitative aspect of betrayal in the emotional state. It's really this much more complicated psychological phenomenon. Take another example, like when people talk about feeling themselves, I don't feel like myself today, you might say, and then you feel better tomorrow, and then you say, oh yeah, I feel like myself again today. Again, I don't think there's a special myselfness qualia or myselfness phenomenal character. Again, I think you're just assessing lots of different informational sources to arrive at that judgment. Okay, my point here is that, remember, I said S1 is actually ambiguous. This was pointed out to me again by HBS students. Which means that it can fail to direct introspection in the right way. What we want to happen is that you direct introspection to the special ownership phenomenology. And what I think actually happens is that S3 is actually inducing you to do this more complicated reflective exercise, right? And it's, S3 is kind of an odd statement because obviously the rubber hand is in your own. And so when you're asked to actually respond to that and not dismiss it out of hand, I think what you end up doing is think about it. So let's go back to Edie and Larry. So Edie's responses are in red, and she says, it feels like you're touching my hand with that one. That's the causal claim. Larry wants her to consider the ownership claim. Let's assume that she does, in fact, also endorse that, recognizing that it's a distinct kind of phenomenology. Now, how might she get there? Again, she knows that it's not her hand. She's being asked to consider it. And I think one thing that she can do is that given that she herself has spontaneously reported the causation phenomenon, she might then reason that, of course, if I feel a touch through something, it's usually through my hand. I'm feeling the touch as if it's coming through the rubber hand. And in that context, I think one can imagine that one would positively respond to the ownership claim, S3. And again, this would be reflection, it's not introspection. And in this world, there is no special qualitative field of ownership. You're just responding to that positively because you're reflecting on these different propositions. The other reason I think that S3 gets you to do that is because of how it's phrased. So while the English verb feel has a clear somatosensory use, I feel a pain, I feel a tickle, I feel a touch on my finger, it also has a kind of cognitive and reflective use. And in that use, we often say things like, it feels as if, it looks like, it looks as if. And so here's just some examples. I feel like you're not respecting me or respecting my contributions in our discussion. Feels like the governments in the world aren't taking the coronavirus pandemic seriously. Or you might have a special affection for, say, your nephew, and you might say you might say it feels like the nephew's my child, right? And there's a kind of ownership idea expressed there, but you're not reporting a special feeling of ownership, right? This is an attitude that you have towards these thoughts. I do find it interesting that in their paper, Botvinnik and Cohn provide one example of a spontaneous report, and it's the following. The subject says, I found myself looking at the dummy hand, thinking it was actually my own. And the thought here for me is that this thought arose for them. They could have obviously, they know that it's false, But the fact that they thought it, I think, puts them in a frame of mind that makes it clear why they would respond positively to S3, the ownership claim. Okay, so this again is about appropriate introspection. Introspection is the instrument that subjects are using to give us data about ownership phenomenology. And the point here is that that's only going to work if you can get the subjects through the questionnaire to direct introspection in the right way. And what I'm arguing here is that we have, I think, good reason to think that this condition hasn't been satisfied. I think a better explanation is, in fact, S3 is inviting this kind of broad reflection and not the isolation of a special ownership field. All right, let me say something very quickly about reliable introspection here. So remember, this is just the idea that, of course, if you're going to use an instrument to gather data, you want to use the instrument in context in which it will give you reliable data. Okay. And here, I think what all we can do is to create conditions that one can argue promote accuracy. For example, just as a necessary condition, make sure that you address direct introspection in the right way. So what I've suggested is that we need to rewrite some aspects of the questionnaire. You want to eliminate confounds by the use of appropriate controls. And this is something that Pete will talk about in just a moment. And here's one thing I just want to raise talk about, which is that since response to the questionnaire involves effectively a working memory task, you got to remember the experience and then report on it. What you'd like to do, of course, then is just allow the subject to be able to introspect accurately and thereby reduce, if you like, cognitive load. Okay, so here's the rubber hand illusion. Again, this is the questionnaire that we use for probing subjects. And one thing I'll note is that the subjects typically respond most strongly to S1, the spatial illusion. And so when you look at large samples, the mean agreement for S3 never reaches 1. Pete has done a study with 353 subjects where the mean agreement to that S3 is only 0.7. Matthew Longo has done a study with 130 subjects where it's only 0.4. And in both of these studies, if you look at S1, the agreement with S1 is typically 2. And then for S2, it's usually about 1. So S3 is by far the weakest in terms of agreement. Now, think about what's going on here. Let's say you have the rubber hand illusion experience and you're having the induction so that you're getting an experience with 3 distinctive phenomenologies: spatial phenomenology, causal phenomenology, and ownership phenomenology. Subjects are not being prompted to focus on it because, in fact, the experimenter wants to avoid suggesting anything. So you have the induction, and now you've got to remember really distinctive kinds of experiences, detect them, and discriminate them. And that is a kind of working memory load. In fact, it's harder when you're not prompted, right? And when we do a lot of working memory tasks, it's helpful to know what you're supposed to attend to. And I think the fact that this is difficult, if there is such a phenomenology, it's reflected in, if you like, the noisiness of the data, right? That is to say that subjects have a weak response to S3. So this is to raise the question, or one way of pushing on the question about the reliability of introspection in this context. And certainly when I think you have noisy responses, like if you're seeing something in a fog, you're going to appeal to other information sources to help you render a judgment that you feel confident in. Okay, so just very quickly, some general lessons from my section before I turn it over to Pete. I think in general, we need to be careful about multiplying phenomenology unnecessarily. And when I say unnecessarily, I mean that we shouldn't just like do that, that kind of quick argument from the fact that I have an experience where I would report in a certain way to the conclusion that there is in fact that kind of phenomenology. Right? So we want to use introspection in a way where we can argue in the case of our use of introspection that it's likely to be reliable. In the case of the rubber hand illusion, the constructive suggestion here is that we need to revamp those questionnaires. We've been using the same questionnaires as Botvinnik and Cohen used. And as I noted, there are reasons to think that they're inadequate to direct introspection. We need to focus on conditions in which we can argue for the reliability of introspection, right? And we have to do the right controls, right? So that's now going to be something that Pete will talk about. So I will stop my share. Pete.
Okay, how's that? You see that?
Yeah, no problem.
All good? Okay. So I'm going to start by talking about domain characteristics. This term was coined by Martin Orn about 60 years ago. Describe domain characteristics as the totality of cues which convey an experimental hypothesis to the subject. The idea being that if participants can discern experimental aims, then their responses may reflect demand characteristics rather than other posited mechanisms. So if the participants can work out what's expected of them, or at least if they have an idea of what's expected of them, then their responses may reflect these expectations. In the rubber hand illusion, demand characteristics are controlled by comparison of the illusion and control conditions. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about those. These are Botvinnik and Cohen's original statements and the responses to them. Botvinnik and Cohen didn't describe these as control statements. They just reported all the scores for everything, but these have come to be generally regarded as control statements. So the first three statements here are considered to be the illusion statements, and the rest of these statements are considered to be control statements. For example, it felt as if my real hand was turning rubbery. These are things that the experimenter does not expect the participant to experience as part of the illusion. So when running one of these experiments, you would compare the illusion items between synchronous stroking and asynchronous stroking conditions. So this is when the brush strokes on each hand occur at the same time or at different times. And you would also compare the synchronous condition agreement for these illusion items with the synchronous condition agreement for these control items. The logic is that if agreement scores are higher for illusion than control conditions, then domain characteristics are considered to have been controlled. Here's an example. I just picked this at random. It's from a paper from about 10 years ago, I think, No Pain Relief with the rubber hand illusion. These are people's responses to the rubber hand illusion, their agreement scores. You can see here the synchronous condition illusion statements, and down here the control statements. And the illusion statements are higher than the control statement agreement scores. Similarly, synchronous and asynchronous illusion statement report differ. We have higher report synchronous than asynchronous illusion score. So this would be taken as evidence that the rubber hand illusion is not attributable to suggestion effects or domain characteristics. But there's an assumption that lies behind that. In order for these statements or these conditions to control for domain characteristics, expectancies, what participants expect, would have to be well matched across illusion and control conditions. And if expectancies differ, then any difference in report may be attributable to domain characteristics. So last year I tested this. The simple procedure of just showing participants a video which demonstrated the rubber hand illusions, the short video, 60 seconds, showing what happens in the procedure. The participants then answered the standard rubber hand illusion questionnaire, but for expectancies rather than experience. So they were asked to report how much they would expect to experience particular effects if they were a participant undergoing the procedure shown in the video. So the results I'm about to show are not from people that have actually taken part in a rubber hand illusion experiment. They are people that have just seen a video that shows them what happens in a rubber hand illusion experiment. And these are the results. So this is the expectancy rating, how much people rated, how much they expected to experience each item. These are the mean scores gathered together. So this is for the illusion conditions. In the synchronous condition, the control here for asynchronous stroking of the illusion statements, and these are for the control statements. And here you can see the individual statements, what Wayne was referring to as S1, S2, and S3 here. Asynchronous is next to them in each case, and these are the control statements. So we can see that what people expect very closely matches what they report in the illusion. We can look again at this example paper. The questions here, the 3 illusion questions, the control questions. In both cases, it matches pretty well. Again, this is people taking part in a rubber hand illusion experiment. And this is reports of what people would expect to happen who've never taken part in a rubber hand illusion experiment, but just been shown a video about. So it's not safe to say that expectancies are matched. This assumption is not met. The controls are not valid. I'll just throw in a quick note here about proprioceptive drift. This is considered an implicit measure of the rubber hand illusion. People are asked to report where they feel like their hand, which they can't see, is located before and after induction of the illusion. And the difference between their estimates before and after induction is called proprioceptive drift. We just show people this picture, ask them to use a slider to report where they would expect their hand to be perceived to be. And we get the classic proprioceptive drift effect in expectancies alone. I raise that because since this paper came out about a year ago, I've often been met by this misconception. There's a general misconception that demand characteristics arise from experimental instructions, and they can arise from experimental instructions, but it's important to remember that they arise from any aspect of the experimental situation. And this case illustrates that quite well, I think. So on the left here, we have an expectancy experiment, so just people watching a video, when we didn't take this drift measure. On the right, we have an expectancy experiment when we did take this drift measure. We asked people to consider where they would feel like their hand was. And if you look at what happened to scores for this statement, it felt as if my real hand were drifting towards the right hand, towards the rubber hand. We can see that while it looks like the other control statements, when we don't take this measure, it looks like the illusion statements in terms of expectancies when we do. And it's sort of easy to see what may have happened there. You ask somebody to report where they feel that their hand might have moved to. Participants expect that you're expecting them to feel like their hands move somewhere. So because these control methods are invalid, it's possible that the rubber hand illusion might be an imaginative suggestion effect. Of course, that's different to evidence that it is an imaginative suggestion effect. We just can't rule out that it may be. And in considering that, I just want to return to Martin Orn again. He was a hypnosis researcher, and his work on demand characteristics grew out of hypnosis research. And although demand characteristic effects have generally been considered by most researchers to be limited to bias and compliance effects, this isn't something that Orn thought. As he said, it became clear from extensive interviews with subjects that response to demand characteristics is not merely conscious compliance. He didn't really go into this in detail in his work, and it's been ignored, but it forms the background for what I'm going to present next. So What do I mean by imaginative suggestion? Here's an example of an imaginative suggestion. Suggestion for experiencing magnetic hands. It's a standard hypnotic suggestion. Now extend your arms ahead of you with your palms facing each other, hands about a foot apart. Hold your hands about a foot apart, palms facing each other. I want you to think about a force acting on your hands to pull them together, as though one hand were attracting the other. You're thinking of your hands being pulled together and they begin to move together. So you can see it's an invitation to experience a particular state of affairs. This is what we would call a direct suggestion. People are being directly invited to experience something. As a response to this, we would ask people to rate how strongly they felt a force between their hands, for example. So hypnotizability is the ability to generate experience and associated neurophysiological changes to meet expectancies which arise from imaginative suggestion in the hypnotic context, in the context of a hypnotic induction. It's a normally distributed and a stable trait. If you test somebody across a 25-year span, their scores will remain very similar. The results I'm going to present here from this SWASH, Sussex Waterloo Hypnosis Scale, measures response to 10 suggestions for changes in experience. Those are here. They're taken from the earlier Waterloo scale. You can see they include things like hands lowering or moving together, what we'd call idiomotor suggestions. And then there are hallucinations of experiencing mosquito, taste, there's paralysis suggestions, and suggestions you can hear music or you're not able to see something, etc. So finally, I'll just talk about this hypnotic context slightly. What do I mean by the hypnotic context? Well, everybody's got some idea of what hypnosis is. Hypnosis is seeped into popular culture. Typically, there's some idea of a authoritative figure having control over some weak-willed individual. There's some sort of hypnotic induction, which is being done here with this prop. There's some sort of trance state. All these are elements of what I'm calling here the hypnotic context. But what has been often overlooked is that imaginative suggestion doesn't require the hypnotic context, response to imaginative suggestion, that is, nor any hypnotic induction. This has been known for a long time. Here's Clark Hull in 1933, saying no phenomenon whatever can be produced in hypnosis that cannot be produced to lesser degrees by suggestions given in the normal waking condition. This has been followed up. People have attempted to popularize this idea. There was Barber's creative imagination scale in the 70s. Irving Kirsch has used this term imaginative suggestibility to describe imaginative suggestions outside the hypnotic context in response to. But most imaginative suggestion research is still within the hypnotic context. We recently introduced this term, phenomenological control. We intend this term to describe these trait differences and the ability to generate experience in response to imaginative suggestion. We extend it to direct or implicit imaginative suggestion and in a wide range of contexts. We want to move away from hypnosis because it's connected to all that hypnotic context, which is wrong, and refers to sleep, which is actually unrelated to. We also want to move away from such suggestibility because this implies being manipulated and acting against your intentions. And this isn't what happens in hypnosis. You can't get anybody to respond in a hypnotic state or to an imaginative suggestion that they don't want to. Just a little bit of historical perspective on that although hypnosis generally uses direct suggestions, this is such as the magnetic hands one I introduced earlier, before it was called hypnosis. Its kind of effect was known as mesmerism. His Franz Mesmer introduced it. He thought that he was manipulating the magnetic fluid, which was a credible idea at the time, or relatively credible. He'd repeatedly pass iron rods, and later his hands, after he fell out with his iron rod maker, over subjects' bodies, and this would cause them to convulse or to have experience analgesia or wide range of effects and striking changes in experience. The term hypnosis replaced the term mesmerism, as it was no longer considered credible in the late 19th century that magnetic fluid could be driving these effects. And hypnosis focused on direct suggestion. As a result, I think implicit suggestion effects have received relatively little attention ever since. But before there was hypnosis, there was this implicit mesmerism. So here's the proposal. Demand characteristics in experiments can act as implicit imaginative suggestions, generating expectancies which are met by phenomenological control according to this trait ability, just as in hypnotic responding. Council and Kirsch made a similar point in 1989. The brushing of fake and real hands simultaneously within the context of a scientific experiment may generate expectancies which act like implicit imaginative suggestions, just as in mesmerism. And if so, the hypnotizability score, response to those hypnotic suggestions, should predict the rubber hand illusion response. And also expectancies should predict a rubber hand illusion response. So in this study, the paper came out last year. One of the effects we looked at was the rubber hand illusion. We measured hypnotizability using the swash and response to the rubber hand illusion in 353 people. We used the standard rubber hand illusion measures, and we used the standard rubber hand illusion statements with an additional expectancy statement and just one control statement, visual hallucination. And these are the results. These are just to illustrate the correlation here. It's just correlational study. The hypnotizability the score has been used to split into 4 quartile groups. So then here we have the least hypnotizable people, and here we have the most hypnotizable quarter. You see that these scores increase with hypnotizability. Note though that the difference between synchronous and asynchronous report is there at each level. It's just that in the least hypnotizable people, it's mostly a difference between levels of disagreement. These negative numbers here are disagreement with the statement. And in the highs, it's more different levels of agreement. If we look at the expectancy ratings, we see that difference is there. If we look at the control statement, visual hallucination, we see the same pattern, but we don't, scores aren't quite as high, but we still get a response in the highest group there, report of a visual hallucination. So there is this relationship consistent with the rubber hand illusion being an imaginative suggestion effect. So we asked, how much is this likely to bias existing reports of the rubber hand illusion? To illustrate this, we took data from previous experiment and did a median split by hypnotizability score. So we split it down the middle into the highest and lowest halves by hypnotizability score. We ran 10,000 simulated rubber hand illusion studies from these samples. The sample size based on the median size in the 20 most influential RHI papers, which we calculated to be 20. In this graph here, the dots, each dot is the mean agreement score for a different simulated experiment. You can see the agreement scores on the y-axis here. Blue here denotes that people were below the median. These are the people that were lower hypnotizability scores or lower in phenomenological control. And orange are the higher scores. This is for the average of statements S1 to S3. And this is just for S3. This is the critical question about ownership. It felt like the rubber hand was my hand. This shows you that you're going to get different responses, whether you draw from the top or bottom of hypnotizability. But to make that a little bit clearer, we ran one sample t-tests in the simulated experiments with an alpha of 0.05, so a sort of standard practice. We're looking for any evidence of agreement scores above 0 as a sort of minimal criterion for registering as experience. Here is the frequency of statistically significant results. In the group above median in hypnotizability, we get this about 7,000 of the 10,000 studies. We did get evidence for experience. In the group that are below the median, we only get 4% of these simulated studies at typical sample sizes showed any evidence of ownership experience. So from that, we concluded that it appears that high phenomenological control participants, highly hypnotizable participants, are required for evidence of ownership at typical sample sizes, I should say. A quick note about proprioceptive drift. We also found that the least hypnotizable people don't get proprioceptive drift. There's a correlation here. So this is the rubber hand illusion. The paper also covered a couple of other effects, which I'll just run through quickly. First, there's vicarious pain. So when, if you show people people in pain being injected or sporting injuries, then they will report, some people will report experiencing pain. Again, here we have the hypnotizability scores along the bottom. This is for the total number of pain responses. This is for the intensity of pain. And this is for the tendency to localize the pain to the particular place on the body that's shown in the video. And we see these similar relationships to in the rubber hand illusion in each case. Mirror touch synesthesia is similar to mirror pain, but is to vicarious pain, but is more rare. I think it's only a few percent of people respond to these kind of things. If somebody sees somebody being touched, if you see a video of somebody being touched, then they will experience that touch. It's usually attributed to mirror neuron activity. But the mirror touch synesthetes turn out to be highly hypnotizable. The average score for the mirror touch group is equal to the cutoff for the top 13% of the hypnotizability database that we used. So rubber hand illusion research requires the development of valid control measures. You need to match expectancies between illusion statements and control conditions. But also, we need to match the suggestion difficulty between illusion statements and control conditions. To recap on expectancies, this question, it seemed as if I was feeling the touch of the paintbrush in the location where I saw the rubber hand touched. Here we see the expectancies for that statement. This statement here, which is usually used as a control statement, it seems as if I might have more than one left hand or arm, is not a good control statement for this. We can see that just from the expectancies here. They need to match and they don't. But if, say, for some reason we wanted to assert that people were experiencing that their real hands were turning rubbery, a good control for that might be this one. They look very, very similar. It appeared visually as if the rubber hand were drifting towards the left, towards my hand. So I'm not saying that anybody wants to do that, I'm just pointing out that in principle it's possible to match these things in terms of what people expect. And that's what you'd need to do in order to be able to control classical domain characteristic effects. In order to control imaginative suggestion effects, you need to go one step further. Different imaginative suggestions, although they'd be relatively well matched in terms of expectancies, in that the participants know that they're expected to respond to what they're being asked to respond to. Nevertheless, people vary in whether or not they can do it and the degree to which they'll experience these things. So about 80% of people will experience idiomotor suggestions, such as that your hands are moving together because feels like there's a powerful magnet there. But far fewer people, I've used this example of hand lowering, in fact, far fewer people will experience amnesia. And so we end up with a weaker report score, a smaller support report. For the magnetic hands here, for the moving hands together, we could compare that to the mosquito hallucination, experiencing a mosquito that isn't there buzzing around you and landing on your hand. Now, like the difference between synchronous and asynchronous stroking, for example, or the difference between illusional control statements, we could take a difference measure between these. On the x-axis here, we have hypnotizability, and here we have the difference between a hand lowering response and an amnesia response. You see that there's no relationship here with hypnotizability, just as there was no relationship between that difference measure and between the synchronous and asynchronous difference measure and hypnotizability. And the same again with the moving hands together in mosquito hallucination. There's no relationship there with the difference measure. So a difference in response is not related to hypnotizability, but we wouldn't want to take this as evidence that there's a magnetic hand experience which is not attributable to suggestion effect. It's simpler to propose that there's just one of these effects more difficult than the other. So we need to match control and experimental statements on response to direct imaginative suggestion as well as expectancy. So final note, embodiment effects were intended as a case study for what we think is a much more general issue. So I've been publishing papers on this for about the last year or so, and there's been a lot of focus on the rubber hand illusion, but there's nothing special about embodiment here. It just happens to be the first thing that we've looked at. So here's just a quick example of something that we've been looking at recently. This is the visually evoked auditory response. It got quite a lot of attention a couple of years ago. People report hearing sounds when they watch silent moving videos. It took off online because of the this image. So let you just watch that for a moment, see if you experience any sound when you watch it. Apparently 20 to 30% of people do experience some sound watching that. So to test this, we took the stimuli from this paper. It used more abstract moving images and asked people to rate on a 0 to 5 scale, just as the SWOSH does, how much they experience the auditory experience. And we also used a slight difference here. We didn't use the SWOSH, we used this new scale we've developed, the phenomenological control scale, which is exactly the same as SWOSH, but it's had all the hypnotic context removed. There's no induction or any mention of hypnosis or relaxation or anything like that. And the results here were, again, very similar to these other cases. The higher your phenomenological control scale, the much more likely you are to be experiencing this visually evoked auditory response score. visually evoked auditory response rather. So we think that this is it's at least consistent with these being at least partially imaginative suggestion effects. They may be entirely imaginative suggestion effects. Note that this is really about mechanism. People could be having these experiences in everyday life, but the mechanism may be the same as the mechanism which drives hypnotic respondent. So there are stable trait differences in the top-down control of phenomenology to meet expectancies. These have traditionally been studied in hypnosis. When expectancies and imaginative suggestion effects are not controlled for, then the mechanism behind experimental effects may be the same as the mechanism behind imaginative suggestion effects. A rubber hand delusion experience may be generated partially or entirely according to phenomenological control abilities to meet expectancies arising from domain characteristics. And phenomenological control confounds interpretations of experimental measures. New controls are required. And I just want to thank my collaborators, Zoltan Deans, Warwick Roseboom, Anil Seth, Ryan Scott, Jamie Ward, and Vanessa Burton, and also all the volunteers that help with the data collection in that huge rubber hand study.
All right, thank you very much, Peter and Wayne. So first, could you just get out of the slide option so that we can get people to join us. So let me remind you, if you have a question, please write your name down in the Q&A option. Go to the bottom of the screen, click on Q&A, write your name down, and I will promote you to the status of panelist, and you can ask your question directly to Wayne and Peter. There's no need to ask me the question. Shaheen, do you want to start? Shaheen? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was great. Thanks to both of you. I have a question for Peter. I have looked at the hypnosis research, and one thing that I felt like was happening was, especially with this claim that you mentioned, that you can't really get someone to do something under suggestion or under hypnosis that they don't want to do. And I tried to trace this claim back to the source, and it's one of those things where like scientists cite each other and the citation cites another person who cites the citation, and then eventually it's just a claim. And the only experiment I found was one where they tried to hypnotize people and get them to sell heroin, and you can see why there aren't that many of those experiments. Yeah. So where does this claim come from? Like you can't really experiment with this in the lab. You can't really, it's not ethical to get people to try to do something that they don't want to do. So why does everyone make this claim that you can't get someone to do something under hypnosis that they don't want?
Largely from that, and also from there being, I mean, there was a lot of military interest in hypnosis at one point. I mean, Martin Orne, in fact, was involved in that in the famous MK Ultra program. They were trying to get people to do things that they didn't want to do. There's no evidence that you can get people to do things that you don't want to do. Let's put it like that. And it's very.
But there's also no evidence that you cannot, right?
Well, there's the evidence, as you say. There's this example from the drug dealing example that you gave. That's a classic. Probably the classic, but the big problem with this stuff is, of course, domain characteristics. You put somebody into a particular situation in the lab, they know that it's not actually going to be too dangerous. There was a Darren Brown show where he got somebody to shoot Stephen Fry, but of course that guy knows he's not going to be shooting Stephen Fry. He knows Darren Brown's not going to give him a real gun. So, yeah, there were other studies around at that time. None are coming to mind at the moment, but yeah, you're right. This is a often made claim, but I think that if you could get people to do stuff with hypnosis that they didn't want to do, then there'd be a lot more of that going on.
All right, thank you very much. Nathan, the space is yours. Nathan, friendly. Nathan? Peter Stockerson, do you want to go next?
No mic.
No mic. Okay, so Nathan doesn't have a mic. So let me just ask his question.
Yes. Okay.
Are embodiment and ownership used interchangeably here? And Peter, you'll be next.
Are
embodiment and ownership being used?
Yes.
I guess equivalently here.
How are you using these two concepts, embodiment and ownership? Are you using them interchangeably?
I mean, I was referring to embodiment in a general sense as a research field. So I was saying that all those cases might be considered related to embodiment. I think that ownership, for me, I would talk about specifically in the rubber hand illusion.
Wen, do you want to add something on that question?
No, I agree. That ownership is a much more specific claim, perhaps within interest in an embodiment and other somatosensory, multisensory effects. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Peter, floor is yours. Peter Stockerson, thank you.
Yes, okay, I can. Yes, thank you very much. This is really very interesting for me. I have Alzheimer's, and I have for the last 12, 14 years. And more and more over time, I've found the kinds of hallucinations and so forth that you're talking about and effects. For instance, you go.
So that's the question.
So the question that I have is that in among the people that I'm studied and awareness, they make it very clear that the large motes of these people, it's a matter of not having enough proper information to actually come out with a good idea of what's going on. That is to say, that is to say that, and the word is said, it is said in that field that is that the brain does not like to make it look stupid. So what happens is they do things that
Give any answer.
that will give any answer that looks reasonable, even when they're wrong. And that's in fact this in my world. This is often the case. And so I sort of wonder why this is about people and why not about brains. What are the really active forces here? That's my question.
Wen and Peter.
I think they're sort of about both. It's about people through thinking about ultimately what their brains are doing to allow them to respond or deal with these sorts of situations that you're talking about, Peter. So we didn't talk about the brain per se, but that's definitely in the background of when we talk about mechanisms and information processing and response and so forth, we take that to be brain-based. And so ultimately this will have to be cashed out in those terms. But we're starting more with this sort of more general phenomenon that you have personal experience with, that kind of situation. That sound about right, Pete, or Jonah?
Yeah, that's reasonable to me. This is just the level that we're dealing with at the moment is subjective reports, etc.
Let me remind the audience that if you have a question, you need to write your name in the Q&A box. Just click on Q&A box and write your name. That will promote you to panelist. While some are doing this, I have quite a few questions for you guys. So take the opportunity of a lapse in Q&A now to ask some of them. And let me just start by, it's a question in the sense that's going to be addressed to both of you. And but I'll start by formulating to Peter, and then I'll move it to Wen. So Peter, I was not, I think I got it, but I was not quite sure exactly what you think imagination, that's not exactly the term you use, but imagination involves. does that involve producing an experience, or does that involve just making a judgment about what's experienced? Or are you neutral, or could it be both? Are you neutral? Now, before answering, let me just ask the question to when, what do you take to be the right answer? And furthermore, how does it bear on reliability? Because if it involves creating something like an experience, actually introspection turns out to be reliable. It's just unreliable about the mechanism by which we got the experience, right? Yeah. Go ahead, guys.
Yeah. So for me, absolutely. I mean, I'm in any given case, I would remain agnostic as to whether somebody was really experiencing something or just claiming to experience it. But if we look at the wider case of response to imaginative suggestion within hypnosis, there's a huge amount of research which would suggest that people's experiences are changing. So you can look at things like analgesia would be the most famous. You can have people will undergo repeatedly, dental surgery with a hypnotic suggestion. That's quite a commitment to trying to please the experimenter, trying to please the dentist. Or other examples, I mean, any sort of, any of the typical measures we fall back on, such as neurophysiological measures, bold signal, etc. If you give somebody an imaginative suggestion of a particular thing, such as for a visual experience, then you'll have the expected activity in visual areas, etc. So, and then the other more implicit measures, such as the use in the rubber hand illusion, like skin conductance, for example. It's well established that you can change skin conductance through direct suggestion. Is there any way that we have of assessing any other experience? Hypnosis tends to come out pretty well. And it doesn't mean that any given person isn't making it up or fooling themselves or whatever. It's going to be a mishmash of everything in any particular case. But yeah, I think that this is why I think that it's possible that imaginative suggestion, phenomenological control, as we call it here, can potentially be an alternative mechanism for the rubber hand illusion in its entirety. That even the experimenters that have personally had that experience of like, well, it really works for me, and they're like, wow, it feels like it's my hand. Right. The mechanism may not be multisensory integration. It may be imaginative suggestion, or it may be a mix of the two.
So when, I really like sensor, but how does it build the reliability claim? Because if that's true, people are reasonably reliable about their experience at the very least, right? If not the mechanism, which I think is granted, we're not very reliable at knowing the mechanisms by which we have experiences, or any thought at all, really. But we might be more reliable for the experiences or the thoughts themselves.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, this is actually a point where Pete and I are not in disagreement, but we're sort of like not completely on all fours. So I think Pete would say that there's good evidence that even in S1 about the spatial illusion, that's a suggestion effect. Because I always thought like the rock solid thing that's going on in the rubber hand illusion, if you've experienced it, is a spatial distortion. Like you feel like there's a kind of change. So even in that case, like what's going on? So you're right, Edouard. That is to say, let's say Pete's mechanism works in the following way, that you induce in yourself imagining, where that's a kind of quasi-sensory phenomenal state of like a change in spatial position. Then, barring the caveat about it being an illusion, I do think then you would be reliable. But then I think the argument for reliability would be something like this, that for those kinds of imaginative contents, we have some good empirical grounds for thinking that we're drawing on perceptual representations of that sort in activating them. And then that simple mechanism might be arguably kicking in at that point. And so for that kind of case, I think I have no, I mean, there's a question about whether or not you're just, you have some propositional representation or analogical representation that's not sensory, that's feeding into it, or you're having an actual experience felt space. So that would still not be resolved by that. But if Pete's right, then I think that would be the explanation. But then I think you're right. It would be reliable and there would be an explanation of reliability. Where it gets tricky is if someone says to you, well, all right, forget all that. I can imagine the rubber hand being my own, right? And now I say, okay, like, all right, like grant you that you've got that state, like what exactly is meant by imagining that the rubber hand is your own? And I mean, that would be an interesting case. When I start talking to people about like, what does that might mean to you? I think when people think about it, it's a really odd situation. I know people will offer that kind of claim, like, yeah, I can imagine it, but it's not clear what you're imagining. But if you did claim that, then yeah, we would be sort of in a way back at an earlier stage because is that kind of?
Oh no, yeah, definitely, yeah. I think that's really helpful. I have more questions, but I think Greg has joined us. So Greg, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciated this. This is definitely not my field, so if this is not directly related, but it seems as though there's some relationship with the well observed over centuries phenomenon of the phantom limb, the pain or in the phantom limb with amputees. And I mean, that's well documented phenomenologically, and also I assume there's some sort of neurological investigation of that phenomenon. More recently, I'm aware, and this is not my field, of reports where people with artificial limbs, not only in terms of embodiment and ownership, understand them to be theirs, but also seem to experience physical phenomena in those limbs. Semi-related, I'm sure. I don't know if it's directly related, but if you want to comment on that.
Certainly, I would think that the case that you described there of people experiencing, for example, touch in an artificial limb, that seems to me that the mechanism behind that could be directly phenomenological control. It's kind of, in these cases, such as when you get to these cases with neurological damage, it can be hard to disentangle these things. My assumption this stuff is going on all the time. That there are appropriate contexts, or what are considered appropriate context for generating a particular experience. We could think about things such as speaking in tongues, for example, or in some cultures where there's spirit possession is common, or channeling spirits, or pretty much anything that you describe as paranormal could be explained in the same way. It may just be a fundamental aspect of human functioning, which comes into play at certain times. The particular case of your phantom limbs, I don't know. It's an interesting one because there's pretty sort of clear neurological story about it. But then the treatment of it, the mirror box treatment, is that placebo effect mediated through phenomenological control, or I don't know. To be honest, I have no idea.
But the nice thing about those sorts of cases is that, maybe going back to the brain point, is that you can start to spin a kind of mechanism for it that at least starts to explain why you might make certain kinds of judgments in those cases, or indeed why you might actually have a feeling in certain cases, because some of that's spatial, right? And I think this is what I would really love to happen, which is you take something like the rubber hand illusion, and we went from S1, which was a kind of spatial multisensory thing that we felt like we could, I mean, people were caught onto that because we have other examples where people talk, there are theories of multisensory integration at the level of what neurons are doing, at the level of computation, and there are other cases of multisensory spatial illusions like ventriloquism. So you feel like there's a good story to tell there, and that you can start to make intelligible. Like, so there's still the worry that Pete mentioned about phenomenological control in that case, but like, let's say it was real, you could understand that. But when you get to like ownership, this is where, I guess my question is what is the basis for taking that particular readout as indicating some special kind of perceptual feel, as opposed to just indicating that when you're confronted with something odd and you have noisy data, i.e. internally noisy data, that you're trying to respond with as much sort of informational source as you can to generate a kind of judgment. And, but that's, from the introspection side, that's a really kind of interesting case, because you're not just like having the simple readout, you're doing something really complicated and automatically. And so I think the interest is not in the ownership claim, it's in the interest is in your generation of an agreement to that claim. I think that's what's really interesting and why we cotton on to kind of saying funny things about our experiences.
Yeah, so I had a similar line of thought, not about phantom limbs, but also about synesthesia. So the example of the GIF you showed us, I was wondering whether you would want to say that maybe many phenomena or instances of synesthesia are partly driven by this, or could be driven at the very least by this mechanism.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure about synesthesia itself yet. I mean, my current working hypothesis really is that in any given case, in anything where we have any data from an experimental situation, if domain characteristics have not been well controlled, and they usually aren't, then those experimental data are likely to be at least contaminated by, if you put it that way, they're likely to be at least confounded by phenomenological control. The case of synesthesia in the lab, I think that they tend to have relatively good controls for that sort of thing. They're very wary of that sort of thing with synesthesia itself. These other cases of synesthesia, but I don't know, we need to look at it. But these other cases of synesthesia, they're called synesthesia, such as the visually evoked auditory illusion or the mirror touch synesthesia. I think these are probably something distinct. And I do want to say that I don't stress again that I don't think that means that they aren't real and they don't happen in everyday life, but that mechanism may very well be not what we've imagined it was.
Yeah, that's really helpful. When you want to add something? No, you're good. Nick, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks both. That was really kind of very interesting. I mean, in a way, even more interesting than the original illusion, I think, to sort of really unpack it that way. I mean, it's kind of, yeah, very interesting. So it wasn't a big question, but I was kind of interested. When you was looking at the questions that were asked the participants, I guess I just had a few more questions about how the original experiment and those kinds of experiments, are done there. You kind of touched on some of this, and maybe it was Wayne, especially on some of the language that was kind of used, the sort of seems versus feels. And I was quite struck by the questions that they're quite differently worded. Sometimes it was as though, sometimes as if. Well, why wouldn't you formulate all the non-important parts of the questions in exactly the same way all the way through? And if you had comments on that. And then were all the participants asked those questions sort of in that order, or was there any kind of randomization? Because I was wondering, and maybe that was part of what you're suggesting, is how the questions are sort of priming you as you kind of go through them. Although the controls, then it flips the other way. How was the experiment done in a little more detail, and what kind of effects do you think that had?
From my perspective, what's quite odd about it is that almost everything that was in that first one-page paper has been sort of, it's like it's set in stone, and that became the entirety of the thing. These same statements or variations on them were used again and again, and presented in the same order usually. Now, sometimes people will randomize those, but usually they won't. And it's this sort of like rigidly sticking to exactly what they did. Although interestingly, you notice I raised a point about if you have proprioceptive drift measured, if you ask people where they feel like their hand is, then that changes expectancies for the one control statement. That in that first study, they didn't do proprioceptive drift on the same sample. So they did it as a separate sample. And I think, for example, that if they'd have done that in the same sample, then that statement probably would have been one of the illusion statements. I think that it was kind of, I don't know, I think that the original authors just came up with some stuff, did it, and it's just, I don't know why it just stayed like that for 20 years.
It's an interesting sociological thing about the way those experiments are done, because I think Pete's right. It's as if it's been really set rigidly in stone. And Nick, the points that you're making about, if you're sort of philosophically minded, you might look at those formulations and worry a little bit about them. And I think some of the things that we brought out, in fact, the fact that the students responded in a way that totally shocked me, because I always thought that S1 was so obvious. This had to be read in a certain way. And I was worried about, it seems as if and looks in the other statements. And it just made it very clear to me that we need to revisit we need to reformulate that questionnaire. I also appreciate the fact, your initial note of the real interest in this is not the original experiment, but in all the things that sort of generate that data. I appreciate that you saw that too, because I think sometimes when we're given this, people think that, we're just like trying to nail the rubber hand people, which maybe there's a little bit of that, but really it's just that there's something really interesting going on, and it's getting occluded by all this talk about ownership. And we could use the rubber hand illusion to ask a lot more interesting questions or other similar phenomena. And I think that would advance the science more.
Oh, thank you.
You're muted, Edward, but I take it you want Colin to get on.
Colin, the floor is yours for the last question.
Yeah, thanks. All right, sorry to jump in the last minute. But yeah, I was thinking about out-of-body experiences and the use of VR to generate those while you were talking about all this. And I'm sort of wondering whether anything much hangs on the fact that it's a very inert rubber hand that's not responsive to other kinds of feedback that you would get in some of these more sophisticated VR situations, and how you think, whether you think that might provide a better angle for getting at the nature of the experience of ownership.
Yeah, so to me, I think that these cases where, VR is a much better example. If you're asking people about something like presence in VR or whatever, or if you're asking about particular things, when you're replacing people's sensory input effectively, that's there's more going on than just brushing them with a brush. So I think that if there are multi-sensory, there are definitely multi-sensory elements going on there. There's integration going on there. But so I think that that's a very interesting case to look at, because I would say that in those cases, while the rubber hand illusion may be entirely phenomenological control effects, VR isn't, and nevertheless they will most likely come into play. So you could think of this in terms of practical concerns for somebody who was developing VR software. They might, for example, you might test in one sample and accidentally get a lot of people who are high in phenomenological control, who might perceive that as a situation in which they should really generate some experiences, and they'll be absolutely wowed. They'll be just sort of like, wow, it was like I was really there, I was in another place. And then the next group you get in, you accidentally pull from the bottom half of the distribution, and they're all just saying, yeah, it's all right, it's pretty good, but I don't, and you wonder what's gone wrong. So I think that I think there'll be there's a baseline of stuff going on in VR. I'm low hypnotizable. The rubber hand illusion doesn't work on me. I don't get any of it. I don't even get the thing that the referred touch that Wayne does. I feel like I can imagine it and then sort of have that kind of experience if I put a bit of work into it, but it doesn't work. But if I put a VR helmet on, then that undoubtedly has an effect more than these things do.
Yeah, I would just add really quickly to that. I think, Colin, like the case with VR, yeah, you're adding more than just this kind of, this simple manipulation of rubber hand illusion, because you're getting things like prediction and sort of recognition of things. And so if someone says, yeah, I feel this presence in the VR, then and I'm sure you'd be familiar with this, I wouldn't go from that and say, oh, we've got to write about the phenomenology of presence and this kind of, sure, there's a judgment about presence, and it's reflecting that there are these interesting informational processing bits that change in the VR case. And you're tapping into that to talk about what it's like for you. But I think, again, I would just caution against this that kind of simple Cartesian jump, as I called it in there, right? Rather, there's something more interesting going on there. There's a lot more interesting changes in information processing. And why does that shift you in certain cases to make these kinds of judgments? What are you tapping into? And I think that's the interesting question.
Great, thank you.
All right, I think it's time to stop here this lunchtime talk. Peter and Wayne, thank you very much for taking the time and for being our first guest speakers this semester. So it's been really exactly, it's been a great talk. All right, have a good day, and we hope to see most of you next week on Tuesday at noon for the next lunchtime talk by Melissa Jacquard. Have a good day. Bye.